It looks like we have everyone entering. As people enter, I will just say that my name is Aminta Awesome. I'm a senior clinical instructor at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School, as well as a lecturer on law at the law school. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone today to today's webinar, which is entitled Bringing Human Rights Home From Global Principles to Local Impacts. Today's panel is organized by the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I'm an associate and also an admirer. To commemorate Human Rights Day, we will be discussing how global rules and principles shape our everyday lives. I'm happy to serve as the moderator for today's event, and I'm happy to be joined by four esteemed panelists, all of whom are senior human rights and foreign policy fellows at the Carr-Ryan Human Rights Center. Every single panelist today has served on the front lines of human rights diplomacy and policymaking, and as such, they're very well placed to reflect on the topic of our webinar today, the impact of the global human rights norms and processes. In no particular order, I will introduce each of our panelists. I'm taking the liberty to use their first names to make it easy and to keep this informal. I start with Desirée Cormier Smith, who served as the inaugural Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice at the State Department, serving from 2022 until 2025. In that role, she worked to form partnerships around the world, working to combat racial discrimination on behalf of the United States. In addition to being a senior human rights and foreign policy fellow at the Carr-Ryan Center, Desirée is also a proud HKS alum. Next up, we have Maggie Doherty, who in the past served as special assistant to the president and senior director for international organizations at the National Security Council. Maggie's human rights policy work has also led her to work with Congress, with the U.S. Ambassador for the United Nations, and in diplomacy overseas. Next up, we have Kelly Faye Rodriguez, who up until this last year led the Office of International Labor Affairs at the State Department in her capacity as Special Representative for International Labor Affairs. Like Desirée, Maggie, and Jessica, Kelly is also a Senior Human Rights and Foreign Policy Fellow at the Carr-Ryan Center. She also happens to be, fun fact, a native of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So while we're going through this cold snap right now in Massachusetts, she's probably used to this. And last but not least, we have Jessica Stern, former U.S. Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons who served in the Biden administration. Interesting fact about Jessica, she was the first human rights expert to serve in this particular special envoy role for the U.S. government. She was one of just 5 such special envoys worldwide. So thanks to all of you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experiences and insight on this very important and very timely topic. The format of today's conversation will be a moderated discussion. So I'll start us off with a few questions and get us going into a conversation, and then I'll turn into questions from the audience. As mentioned in the chat, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to incorporate as many as possible, aiming to wrap up the session around 11:15. So to kick things off, I want to pose a few questions to the panelists based on the work that you are all doing with the Carr-Ryan Center and the topics that you've been highlighting in your public speaking and in writing. We know it's Human Rights Day today. That day has to do with the history of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When I think about the history of the universal human rights system, I think of it as very much linked to the US history. The poster for today's event, we all saw it. It has highlighted Eleanor Roosevelt and the core role that she played in drafting the Universal Declaration. But I also think of images like the very iconic photographs of an actual unnamed person, a marcher, at the Selma March who was holding the United Nations flag. And that's someone who's working very locally, wanting to convey a desire that global norms will be upheld at home. So we know that Americans and US institutions have always played a role in both building global institutions and also bringing the principles that those institutions espouse back home. So I'd like to kick us off with a question about what we should know. What else should we know about the interaction between the global human rights system and the United States? Whether we're talking about US political life, prominent Americans, and US values, I thought maybe Kelly and Maggie, you might be able to share some thoughts on this question.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for starting us off, and really just appreciate being able to have this conversation with my fellows and with you, Aminta, today. I think you pointed it out, right? There's a real tension, a real blatant tension historically and today, when you think about the US and the global human rights system, where US leaders had played a role in shaping and forming it and fighting for rights. And the US government, corporations and actors have also played a role either as perpetrator or enabler of some of the worst human rights abuse atrocities that we've seen historically and frankly even today. And so I think that tension is really, really important to own, to recognize, and to use. I mean, I see it in the labor rights space where too often violations are normalized and they're just allowed to exist as sort of the status quo or usual business, and that ends up leading to the kinds of moments we're experiencing now. I mean, it's no surprise that for human rights defenders in the United States, this is a really hard time. And from seeing people being abducted on the streets by state actors under the color of law, we don't get to that point without normalizing certain practices, right? Such as detention of children and separation of families. That's happened for years in the US immigration system. So I think that tension is really important to stay close to because that is where we can seek and build transformation. And time and again, we see that struggle really is the birthing space for transformation. And more, I'm hearing and seeing from advocates and colleagues that we really need to think hard about all the ways that we can allow our country to get to where it is right now, and how do we shift that fundamentally? How do we make dignity something that the government espouses and works to protect, and not just advocates in the streets? So yeah, I look forward to more of the conversation, but I think that tension is really, really important to start this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And even the examples that I gave, I was reflecting on them again, thinking about them differently as moments of tension. So when the UDHR was drafted, there was a lot of contestation about what rights would be included and how broad the scope of the declaration would be, and Eleanor Roosevelt playing that role and trying to make it broader, and the Selma marches where you have marchers who are actually fighting for rights at home that they weren't realizing at that time. So yeah, I think that your quote, I put it down because I thought it was really interesting. Struggle being the building space for transformation. Maggie.
Yeah, I think looking back at the beginning and the fact that Americans were so heavily involved in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its founding and the building of the international human rights system. And that does continue. I think that everyday Americans aren't, maybe they are. I know everyone on this panel, has a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and turns and looks to it, but everyday Americans normally do not. But they don't realize how there's a lot of parallels with that, with a lot of the human rights treaties with US law. They don't match up 100%, but a lot of it is either based in US law or we will mirror in US law if we join the treaty. And so I think a lot of people are always look to, oh, what is the US government doing? What's the US government doing on these issues? And not look at, oh, what is the international human rights system doing and how does it exist? And so I think it's important because Americans have always placed a role, even if, like right now, our government, no secret, not participating in the Universal Periodic Review, withdrew from the Human Rights Council. There's still Americans in Geneva working in these bodies because we have such a strong history on these issues and such a great background of academia that allows Americans to engage, even if our government is not engaging with these issues. Another part that I think everyday Americans don't realize, it might be a benefit or ignorance is bliss, but the US has historically, funded the most of the international human rights system. One being we are, the largest contributor to the UN via treaty bodies, but also because, again, normally it is different today. We provide large amounts of voluntary contributions to different human rights mechanisms around the world. And so I think that there's a lot going on in the United States, there's a lot going on overseas, and it's not always seen as, meeting each other. And I think it's important for Americans to realize that a lot of the international system, Americans have had a large part in it and participate in it. And we now see as the US government, as Kelly has highlighted, if the US government isn't able to meet the needs, that people can go to the international system, and they do, to seek help, to seek solidarity with other movements. And so that resource is there. And yes, not everyone can fly to Geneva, but thank God for technology. We can do Zooms, we can do phone calls, and people are able to work on these issues internationally as well as locally.
Thank you.
Minta, do you mind if I jump in on this? I think it's
Yeah, definitely jump in.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that as we commemorate Human Rights Day today, which marks the 77th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we also should remember what was going on in the United States at that time, right? We were still in the thick of Jim Crow. Black Americans were living under racial terror and oppression. Yet we had the U.S. leading the creation of a document saying that every human being has universal rights and dignity, right? And so I think it's important to call out that, as Kelly put it, that tension, I would say hypocrisy. It's also important to note that a year before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1947, the NAACP submitted a petition led by W.B. Du Bois to the United Nations to hold the United States accountable for the injustices inflicted upon Black Americans, going back from the human trafficking of Africans to the United States as part of the transatlantic slave trade, and then the enslavement of Africans and their descendants for centuries, and then to Jim Crow. And there was a lot of pushback by the U.S. government, including the State Department, including by many accounts, Eleanor Roosevelt herself, on that petition, basically saying that it would embarrass the United States when we're trying to position ourselves as a counter to the Soviet Union as a champion for human rights. So that tension has always existed, even as we commemorate the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as we point to it as an important document to uphold the dignity and rights of all humans, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or other identification.
Amanda, I can't help myself but be inspired by my colleagues. Can I just jump in really quickly?
Definitely.
Um, it's funny, we're speaking from different perspectives, but we're all kind of harping on the same point because it's so profound. The difference between the promise of the UDHR and its implementation and the contested role of the US in this framework. And I think what Maggie was saying is so invaluable, and I just want to put a finer point on it. The US has historically contributed around 23% of the UN's core budget plus the voluntary contributions that she made reference to. That means that the US has disproportionate impact on the United Nations and thus on global human rights standards. The US also has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, one of just 5 nations in the world to do so. And the UN Security Council is the pinnacle of UN power. And as a result of the US's financial and political contributions, the US holds significant leadership positions. So, for example, when you think about agencies like UNICEF or the World Food Program, there's the operating assumption that an American will lead those agencies. And that's not because Americans are exceptional, it's as a direct result of the political and financial contributions we've made. And so I think in this year in particular, one of the things we have to emphasize is that the UN is in crisis and international human rights norms are more needed than ever. And I think that the way forward has to involve a reevaluation of the US's impact on the international human rights system so that it cannot be weakened so badly by just one country.
That's a very good point. And I'm now curious to talk about how do those systems actually impact people's everyday lives? So what is that weakening? I think that everyone has spoken to it in different ways. what impact does that have negatively on how people enjoy their human rights locally in different contexts? So I'd love to hear from you all about how the standards set at the international level, like in an ideal world when the system is bolstered, how does that affect everyday people? And what can you tell us from your experience about what you've seen about how the systems interact with people's lived experiences? Maybe I'll start with you, Maggie.
Sure. I think one of the examples we can use are some of the mechanisms that come out of the Human Rights Council. And one of them in particular that I think was one of the flagship ones and one that the US government really supported was the North Korea investigative mechanism. And so this mechanism was created at the Human Rights Council, but it allowed interviews of North Korean refugees, exiles around the world. Of course, North Korea did not allow the Human Rights Council mechanism to enter its country, but was able to do interviews on the ground and then actually document the abuses that are going on. In North Korea, because it is such a closed society. And so that was able to spur things such as legislation in countries, sanctions, things like that, in order for people who have uh, you know, been abused to see justice and to also see, justice towards the perpetrators and, trying to change the narrative on it. So that's just one example of some of the human rights mechanisms that come from uh, the international system that actually impact people on the ground.
Yeah, so raising awareness of issues and actually going into closed spaces where we might not even know what's going on there, and also pointing towards accountability. I don't know, Desiree, if you want to provide any additional thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an important example, but I think I'm going to take a different perspective on this and talk about the limitations, and talk about the potential and why we haven't fully reached that potential. And
Hmm.
that's because, a lot of countries, including the United States, um, rhetorically support these mechanisms. They may have even helped create them and in their establishments. But we also have to dig a little deeper to see how the participation has been caveated, right? So a lot of the treaties that the United States has signed on to, there have been a lot of asterisks on that. It's like it's non self executing, it's non binding, it's non legally binding, and I think that detail has prevented the real impact that we have hoped for on people's lives. So I'll give you one example. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was a historic document created in 2007, basically affirming the freedoms and rights that Indigenous peoples around the world should have, including the fundamental right to be free from discrimination, fundamental right to equality, affirming self-determination, affirming cultural protections, language, land, and really critically, the free and prior informed consent declaration, which meant that Indigenous peoples should be consulted on decisions that impact them. We know that's never actually been true, right? We've seen that violated, unfortunately, consistently around the world. I highlight this because in 2007, as the world rallied behind this historic document, the United States actually voted against it. And it wasn't until in 2010 did we reverse course. And even in that reversal of course, it wasn't a full reversal, right? So we said, we don't completely reject this, but we'll accept it as like a guiding principle of our policies. But it's non-binding. And so that really does limit the impact of these really, I think, great documents on people's lives here in America. I think there has been real impact on certain places around the world. But when you have a government that really kind of says, accountability for thee, but not necessarily for me, then there's that limitation.
Hmm. Hmm. This is why I love talking to people who've worked in diplomacy because you're such great communicators. I just wrote it down. Asterisks, that's a great way. As a lawyer, I'm always thinking of how to explain reservations, understandings, and declarations. The asterisks is brilliant. I love
Or
that.
like terms and conditions may apply, right?
Yeah.
Aminta, could I add a little bit here on this?
Yeah,
Because I think,
definitely.
um, to Desiree's point, like these systems, these mechanisms, are not living up to their potential. Um, and yet we know that there are places in the US and elsewhere where people are experiencing the kind of fear, intimidation. There is a chilling of rights that occurs in a lot of places. And we can list the examples, right, of authoritarian regimes, workplaces around the world. And this is where, like, I think proper, like, organizing principles are that you need to identify, always look for and find the spaces to amplify voices. What's important about these systems, and why we need to protect them while we build and improve upon them, is that they are often the only platform for people to speak up safely or more safely than they would than they could in their homes or in the communities that they come from. I mean, I think about um, uh, the ILO, even the International Labor Organization, where workers in Burma are under authoritarian regime. I mean, facing incredible violence, and they are using that platform of the ILO to um, tell their stories and to make demands of companies and other private sector actors as well as governments to try to shift the current practices and to exert and have their own dignity be heard and respected, right? And so, again, not wholly imperfect systems and mechanisms, but really, really important for so many people around the world to use and to leverage and to access, where they don't have that opportunity in a lot of places. We don't have that opportunity often to speak up and to be heard and to call out the violations and the challenges and power imbalance that exist.
Certainly. I'd love to get into some of the substantive topics that are front of mind for all of you today. Are there areas where you see that the global principles and standards have led to progress and examples that you can give from your extensive experience, or areas where you think that there are still room for growth beyond the ones we've already kind of discussed already? I don't know, Kelly, would we want to stick with you and then maybe go to Jessica?
Of examples, yeah. So, I think actually I'll start with a lot of people, workers in the United States, think about the human rights systems as abstract entities or processes that really don't impact them. And what I've seen is that where the chilling of rights exists, um, that creates a drive to the bottom in standards and practices, and actually does impact people. So, when I see labor unions speak up on behalf of human rights issues, like we're seeing Italian unions take to the streets in defense of Gaza, where we're seeing in South Africa now, under the G20 leadership, the government make inequality a top priority, global inequality, a top priority to fight against and to change. Those are, I think, really important human rights struggles and examples, leadership that we certainly need to see more of, and that give me inspiration for the future and for how I can contribute and partner with folks who are really, really trying to walk the walk. Um, yeah, those are a couple examples.
Thank you for those examples. Jessica, jump in.
All right, I think I'm going to start with the pressing concerns, and then I'm going to move to areas of progress so that we have an upswing.
Good.
Um,
Give us the bitter
I
pill
mean,
first and then the good, the sugar
I
afterwards.
mean, exactly. We all have to take our medicine. I mean, Aminta, having been a close watcher of U.S. foreign policy over this year in particular, I have to say the cuts to U.S. foreign assistance have had devastating consequences for people around the world, resulting in starvation, refugee displacement, um, denial of health care, causing deaths and suffering. And that's coupled with a broader attack on human rights and the rule of law globally. You know, I specialize in LGBTQI rights, but I use LGBTQI rights as a proxy for talking about how strong human rights and the rule of law are for everybody. Because the test of the rule of law is not how well it protects the most privileged, but how well it defends the most marginalized. And so when I think about the fact that actions as really benign as pride festivals have been banned in country after country, that is a proxy for suppression of freedom of assembly and association and speech. And when we pull out from the LGBTQI specific perspective, we see that in country after country, there is a spike in attacks on journalists, on academics, and on human rights defenders. And the thing that really keeps me up at night, and this is that bitter pill you were talking about, Aminta, is where's the cavalry? Where's the condemnation? You know, these kinds of erosions of basic protections are being normalized instead of condemned in the way that we would expect and really is urgently needed. But things can change. This doesn't have to be the status quo. I mean, we're celebrating Human Rights Day because 77 years ago, the world said, we have learned from atrocity and it serves nobody, and we have to do better. And so, coming back to the LGBTQI example, and I think this also connects with your prior question, I'll say we have seen massive progress when we take seriously what human rights standards teach us about minimum standards for all people. So, for example, um, you were asking about where there's been progress. Well, in India, for example, the High Court decriminalized homosexuality in 2018 or 2019. And it's a voluminous and beautiful decision spanning 497 pages. So, just a quick read for any of our listeners who might be interested over the weekend. But when you read it, you will see that both those advocating for the sodomy law and those advocating against it repeatedly cite UN standards to reach their conclusion. And eventually, when the court ruled and struck down the first and defining sodomy law of the British colonial empire, it used UN interpretations of privacy, specifically Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to get there. So we have seen progress in a lot of places. And one of the things that was really has been a standout moment for me in being a close watcher of debates about rights at the UN is LGBTQI issues are still politicized in ways that is almost unimaginable to me because we're just talking about equal rights for all. But even when you're in the most contentious UN debates on LGBTQI people, you won't hear countries say, kill them all. You won't hear countries say, round them all up. You won't hear countries say, oh, we discriminate against them and we're proud of it. Actually, what happens is the opposite. You have all of these countries that you know are perpetrating human rights abuses against LGBTQI people say, no one should be discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But where we disagree is we disagree in what the implementation of the standard should be. Where we disagree is whether or not those should be universal standards or nationally defined. And so I think, you know, to wrap up on this, I would say, where is there room for growth? We need to strengthen the implementation of human rights standards. Full stop. And we also need to defend multilateralism itself. You know, multilateralism comes out of an urgent recognition that national sovereignty is inadequate for some of the reasons that Kelly cited and everyone has cited. We don't have all of the tools at the national level. And all of our countries are susceptible to authoritarianism or dictatorship in different eras. None of us are perfect. So we need multilateralism to provide that overarching framework so that people will be safe no matter where they live.
That's really great. And as someone who's often, preaching about the impact of international standards, I remember when I was in law school 15 years ago, and the Human Rights Council was beginning of the Universal Periodic Review, and we all thought at the time that this thing is never going to have any impact because it's just as countries giving each other recommendations that they may choose or not choose to accept. But in that time, we've seen a lot of legislation and things like developments of institutions and, you know, advancement on issues like torture prevention that states will say, like, hey, we were tired of being called out at the Universal Periodic Review, so we decided to advance on this thing. At the
Yeah.
same time, there's backlash, and I think a Carr-Ryan Center treasurer of Professor Sicking often saying that the backlash is proof of the power, that there wouldn't be such a strong backlash if these standards and institutions did not have any kind of influence. I'd like to also remind everyone in the audience that we do have the opportunity to give questions in the Q&A. I already see a very good question that kind of builds off of some of the points that you were making, Jessica. But before I get to that, I take the moderator's privilege of asking about some critiques of the international system.
All right. And before we get to
Oh yeah,
critique, I have a lot of them. I do want to take one opportunity to offer an example of progress so that I'm not
wonderful.
always the, I think it's important because obviously there's a lot more work to be done and there's a lot of room for criticism and I have a long list of it. But I also think it's important as people fighting for human rights and particularly fighting for racial justice, that we take stock of the wins, even the small wins. But I want
Yeah.
to acknowledge, I want to highlight one win that is not small. And it is the constitutional recognition of Afro-Peruvians in Peru.
Hmm.
It finally came in December 2024 after decades of activism by the Afro-Peruvian community. But I mention it here because I think while the decades of activism by the Afro-Peruvian community laid the necessary foundation, I think it was actually the help from multilateral institutions that push this over the finish line. And specifically, I'm thinking of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. They did a trip to Peru and they met with members of the Afro-Peruvian community and they heard about the challenges they're facing. And they heard about how they have been pushed to the margins of society, invisibilized, their contributions to society completely erased, right? Their history erased. And they have been fighting, demanding for that basic recognition and using UN documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, like the creation of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent that followed in the footsteps in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues, and they were able to draw global attention to support their campaign. And finally, after decades, they got that constitutional recognition. And that matters because they are the second largest ethnic group in Peru, following indigenous peoples, yet they have never been formally recognized in terms of their contributions to society. And their basic rights, right? So this constitutional recognition matters because it calls more attention to the protection and promotion of their basic rights, human rights, but also social and civil rights and political rights, representation, access to education, health, et cetera, all of these basic things that they have been fighting for decades. So I do think it's important to take stock of the small wins, and I wanted to mention it so that I had one point of positivity, at least one point in this conversation.
No, Desiree, we don't think of you as the naysayer. You're always very inspirational. So I will give it. I also talk a lot about critiques. Um, and I mean, take this question as you will, because I think it may spin out some interesting positive notes. Um, so the critiques that we have now are coming not only from political leaders, but also from thought leaders, academics, even human rights practitioners. I mean, I think the practitioners' critiques, personally, this is my own bias, tend to be more nuanced than the ones coming from elsewhere. But some of them are about the substance of human rights, that there are people say there are too many norms and standards, or too many things that we call human rights. That means that they're watered down and they lack force. Other people critique sort of practical issues, that the international forums where the claims are made are too remote from everyday people. It's hard to get there. I think we mentioned that earlier. Trying to get to Geneva, which I will say is one of the most expensive cities in the world, that international institutions are unaccountable to local constituencies, or that the recommendations they give are not tailored to the political context or the political culture of the places where the recommendations are being sent to. I'd love to hear from you, and maybe starting with Jessica and Desiree, but everyone please jump in. Feel free. Do you think that some of these critiques are valid? And if so, what's the response to them?
Desiree, do you want to go?
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to start us off, but yes, I'm always happy to talk about critiques. Absolutely, these critiques are valid. I mean, having, expecting civil society to be able to get to Geneva, as you mentioned, one of the most expensive cities in the world, to get maybe 2 to 3 minutes max in these forums to express all of their concerns and petitions to their government is absolutely insane. And I remember the first meeting of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. We were so excited that it finally got established, right? This had been decades in the making. People were thrilled that it finally happened. And there was so much excitement that folks had fundraised and raised money from their own communities to send representatives from their local organizations, from folks that could speak to their issues. And that there wasn't enough time for everybody. And I remember just being completely disturbed and frustrated on their behalf that member states were kind of given unlimited time in terms of how many member states could speak. And in a 3 hour session, if member states took up an hour and 45 minutes, and then the panel itself took up 30 minutes, that left, what, 45 minutes for 300 um, civil society representatives to try and get their remarks in. It was just completely unfair. And within the civil society organizations, there was kind of a hierarchy. So there were the bigger ones that had been to Geneva plenty of times before. They knew how it worked. So they knew that they needed to run over to the list and sign up first. Whereas if it was a small organization's first time leaving the country, not knowing the processes, not speaking English, they didn't know they actually had to sign up, right? And so by the time they realized they had to sign up, they might have been number 199 on the list, and only 25 people got to speak. And then another disturbing thing, I'm going to stick on this point, specifically on the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, not because I don't think it's an incredibly important, valuable body, but I think it just, for me, illustrates the challenges here. In that first session, there was no Portuguese translation. There was no Portuguese translation for the first meeting of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, when the largest population of people of African descent outside the continent of Africa is in Brazil. That is absurd. And it was incredibly offensive to the hundreds of Brazilians that have traveled to Geneva to represent their communities in this forum. So it's things like this where, these are rightful critiques. And because I happened to be in the US government seat at the time, representing the US government, leading the delegation, I was able to hear those critiques and use the power and the weight of the US government to elevate them. And so by the next meeting of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, not only was there more time for civil society members to talk, there was also Portuguese translation. And that also, I think, is a reflection of the power of personnel, right? Who is actually sitting in those seats representing these governments? Because at the end of the day, a lot can depend on the person.
Thank you. The power of personnel. I also think that as someone who attended the first forum session as well, I still don't know to this day the story behind it, took over and started impromptu Portuguese interpretation, which
Yeah.
I thought was incredible. It also shows you that in the structures of what happens in the room, there's some things that are going on, but also there, especially among civil society, an effort to still meet each other, get your views across, and make sure that these institutions are still powerful, despite their shortcomings.
And it was also an incredible testament to the fact that people across the diaspora had each other's back. The solidarity
Mm,
across borders was incredibly moving. And it showed that, yes, we are here in the United Nations to appeal to this, august body, but at the end of the day, we got each other. And if
mm,
they don't listen to our concerns, we're still going to fight and we're still going to support each other.
that's great. Jessica, jump in here.
Well, Aminta, no one has more critiques of the human rights system than people who've been discriminated against and had their rights trampled on. And no one has more critiques of the human rights system than human rights activists who've tried to be heard. So I did a stint of 4 years in government, but I spent 20 years as a human rights activist, clawing my way into the UN. And so we'd have to extend this seminar by several hours to even scratch the surface of the limits. But like, this is where I think this moment gets complicated because multilateralism is under attack. That's not a new concept, right? There have always been critiques of the system. It has never been perfect. But I think that the deliberate, intentional pressure on the system to cease functioning, whether we're talking about at the UN or the OAS or at the AU, is a strategy to undermine global systems of accountability. And that's not the same thing as human rights defenders and marginalized people saying the system doesn't adequately center our voices. So I really want to differentiate the critique. I think there are many political leaders around the world who are seeking to undermine multilateralism as a deliberate strategy to avoid international accountability for genocide, for war crimes. The list goes on, for trampling on the rights of their own citizens. That is not the basis of my critique. Um, my critique comes from a very different place. So if you read, the core documents of what's considered to be the International Human Rights Bill of Rights, you won't find any reference to sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics. That does not mean that we are not represented or that discrimination on any of those grounds is not a part of international human rights law. But the challenge in the political processes in and around the UN comes from those who say, we are recognizing too many rights, new rights, and that they haven't been codified in the original documents from 77 years ago, and therefore they have no validity. And I have an enormous critique of that because when you read the ICCPR, the ICIRC, or even the UDHR, you find that every category that lists vulnerabilities, whether it's sex or race, etc., ends with the open-ended clause, and any other status. And it is that clause that has been absolutely indispensable for us, for those of us whose identities have only emerged as political identities and social justice movements in the 77 years since the end of World War II. But when you look at the human rights system as a whole, you recognize that it was never designed to be read as a static system. It was always designed to evolve with growing awareness about needs, growing standards from national law. And that's why we have treaty bodies interpreting those original treaties. So I just want to say that. And I want to just give one example of a victory. So LGBTQI people have been going to the UN for years for justice. And that's because there are more than 60 countries in the world that criminalize homosexuality and roughly 10 countries that punish it with death. So we can't rely on national law to serve us justice. We have to have somewhere else to go. But in recent years, intersex activists have started going to the UN to make their cases known. And I'm so incredibly thrilled to say that last year, the Human Rights Council passed its first ever resolution on the rights of intersex people, condemning unnecessary surgeries, mutilating their bodies. And not only did it pass this historic milestone, it did so in what might be a first in human rights spaces at the UN, certainly for LGBTQI people. It did so with no votes, zero. And it was partially the result of really deliberate and effective leadership by a cohort of states, including South Africa and Kenya. But it also showed that it is possible to use the international system to shed light on groups that are often even overlooked at their own country level.
Thank you
May
for
I,
that. Oh, go ahead,
I
Maggie.
Can I jump in? Yes. Adding on to the many critiques, I would say just going back to the basics of the Human Rights Council, which is supposed to be the premier international human rights body. And as we were talking about earlier, that countries do really care when they are named. So naming and shaming works, but doesn't work all at the same time. But because they care, they try to get on the council. And so when it comes to the council, it has 47 members. And classic UN style, they have different regional groups that you're in, and they do a slate of candidates. And so what happens is different countries work out deals and it's their turn to be on the council. And so instead of the 47 countries around the world that have the most prestigious human rights records being on the council, it's the countries that got their name on the slate, and it's what we call a closed slate. It's not competitive election. Their name's on the slate, therefore they get voted in. And it really hurts the council's credibility because then you have human rights abusers getting on the council just so they can defend their own record or make sure that their record is not even discussed. And it also then hurts all the other work of the council. Like, it's wonderful, as Jessica just said, when there is unanimous agreement on different resolutions, but that's also how the council does the majority of its work. And so sometimes that results in resolutions being watered down because a specific country says, we're going to break consensus. And then everyone like freaks out and like, no, this has to be unanimous. Well, then you have to change this to that. And it waters down the resolution. And you can have 47 countries doing that. And so the actual work of the council gets watered down to the lowest common denominator. And that is going to be low because there are human rights abusers on the council. China sits on the Human Rights Council. Like, that's insane, but that's just how it is. And there are proposals to fix it, to raise the threshold, things like that. But as we all know, the UN is slow when it comes to reform, and that will take a lot of time. And then the one other thing I will say, because we were talking about translation, I'm very excited that hopefully, AI is going to fix our translation problem in the UN. So we'll be able to do it into Portuguese, but also so we stop paying so much money for translation, because that's one of the things that actually costs the most money for Human Rights Council debates and sessions. If they want to have an extra session, the amount of translation, I don't want to put translators out of business, but I'm just saying this is a cost effective way and can make all of those sessions more accessible other than the 5 UN languages.
Thanks,
And
Maggie.
Maggie, just to clarify,
Wait,
Everyone jumping in. Okay.
I have
Go
to
ahead,
say,
Jessica, and then maybe Kelly and Desiree.
go ahead.
there might be other things to talk about, but I just want to say, in terms of the intersex resolution, it didn't pass with unanimous yes votes. I just want to offer that to our audience. So in the Human Rights Council, you can vote yes, you can vote no, you can abstain, or you cannot vote. And if you've ever whipped a vote at the Human Rights Council or any other mechanism that has operated in this way, you know that you live and die on those abstentions and did not vote. And so the intersex resolution definitely didn't sail through. There were quite a number of abstentions or did not vote, but what was really significant was on a major and I think newer category of human rights, there were 0 no votes. And I think that's actually a different example than what Maggie was pointing out that I think has a lot of credibility, which is the way the focus on consensus can water down the strength of resolutions.
Thanks a lot. Kelly, can I get you in really quickly? Then I want to go
Really
to the
quickly.
Q&As.
Okay, so 2 examples of where we've seen states, but also private actors manipulate the system, and really, I've seen this at the ILO, I've seen it at the UN Business Human Rights Forum, where we have countries, whether it's powerful countries, China, intimidating human rights activists, Uyghur and other ethnic minorities, talking about forced labor. And every time they speak, the Chinese government representative has to challenge them, right? That kind of intimidation happens all the time in these systems. And I think, and we've seen, to Jessica's point about resources, how that can even delegitimize in some ways these systems when they worry more about responding to the government funding them. And the US has been the funder, primary funder for the ILO for many years. But no matter what country it is, if you are the primary funder, there really has to be safeguards in place to ensure that these multilateral institutions are able to conduct their work without undue influence from state actors. I've seen it in Bangladesh where workers are killed routinely for exercising their rights. And for decades, I mean, activists had been pushing for the ILO to respond and to hold the government accountable. And I saw how the Bangladesh government previously, before last year's uprising, was able to organize other governments to defend them, and really take out the usefulness and the effectiveness of these instruments and these mechanisms as systems, opportunities for accountability and for change. And I'll just like in where we've seen corporations, powerful corporations and employers really undermine the ability of the International Labor Organization in recent decades. And in this case, they, to Jessica's point, referring back to founding text language, have really challenged the legitimacy of the ILO by arguing that there is no right to strike, that there is no foundational expectation of a right to strike for workers around the world. That they've been able to use that argument to try to undermine the system. And I think that's where we need activists and we need governments to really push for accountability, to really both of these independent institutions and for the actors who are a part of the process of making them better. And lastly, as a bilingual, raised bilingual at home, my mother's from the Dominican Republic. I think it's really important to stress that interpretation is a skill that is an expertise, it's a value, and really, really important for us to invest in and resource in order to ensure access for communities and people around the world to these systems. AI can be helpful, but I think I'm sure Maggie would agree that we do need that capacity in these systems and in diplomacy for it to be effective and for people's voices to really be heard.
And briefly on the AI point, I understand the potential for the interpretation services to be AI and like really whatever, but I think there's also a clear risk of either exacerbating existing biases or further marginalizing those who are already on the margins. So we know that the output of AI is only as good as its input, and we also know that the input tends to be based on a certain segment of society. So when I hear AI in translation, I think immediately to its inability to translate certain accents or dialects, right? And so I think there's a real risk there, also not discounting the potential.
Great, thank you. I would like to go to the Q&A because we have a couple of really good questions that center on the question that I had, which is about the crisis of multilateralism right now and of foreign aid and what that effect has on human rights. So one question was about a question to the panelists about how do you see human rights surviving in this modern time when you have this sort of might makes right um, ideology kind of taking over the world, not just in the US, but elsewhere. We see governments sort of disinvesting in social protection systems and investing more in military power. How will human rights survive in this modern time? And then there was a question about um, what should be the message for the remaining 3 years of this administration. The person asking the question was pointing out that, yes, US institutions, US NGOs, and academics are still engaged in these debates, but there's a real fear internationally, a climate of fear, defunding, um, NGOs feeling demoralized to speak on these issues, and that the policy support and the funding support is a really bolstering for these systems to actually work. So what should be the message for the next 3 years of the administration um, to sort of overcome this?
All right.
Yeah, Jessica, then maybe Desiree.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, Ryan and Yolanda. No easy questions on Human Rights Day, I see. Um, so Ryan said a declaration of war seems more popular today than a declaration of human rights. I mean, that kind of sums up why we're having this conversation right now. I mean, even the move of the Trump administration to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War is just such an act of aggression. It's quite remarkable. Um, I think there are two different influences pulling in different directions. One is the desire of some states to really undermine the human rights system, and the U.S. government is the one I'm most familiar with, so I'll use that as an example. Um, when I was the special envoy for LGBTQI rights, I worked in the Bureau for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor alongside Kelly and alongside Desiree. And in that capacity, often went and briefed Maggie when she was on the Hill. And DRL was, as the acronym for the Bureau was known, was consisted of about 300 people out of around 80,000 people that worked at the State Department. So it was a very small fraction of the overall institutional size. And I would say it punched above its weight. Um, I think it punched above its weight in the eyes of its critics and its advocates. Um, that bureau, DRL, has basically been gutted by the Trump administration. And what was once around 300 staff people is now around 20 staff people. It's also effectively been structurally demoted. So it no longer has the mandate that is essential in a hierarchy like the State Department to have access to critical decision making. Um, but even more than that, it as a mechanism is now reinterpreting and undermining human rights. So the Bureau no longer talks about human rights, it's promoting this concept of so called natural rights. And natural rights is a concept that means a few different things. One, it's not clearly defined. And that's part of the reason why a government like the Trump administration is promoting it. International human rights law has developed over 77 plus years. We know what it means. It's defined in treaties. There's considerable jurisprudence. We can debate how to interpret and apply it, but it does have a core set of values. Natural law is an undefined and vague concept, not governed by international law. Second, natural law promotes national sovereignty over multilateralism or international accountability. And that goes back to what we were talking about before and what I think Ryan is referencing. It's really frightening when states are advocating to be able to do whatever they want. And that is a fundamentally anti rights positionality. We don't want states to be able to do whatever they want. We want there to be a global code of ethics that says genocide is wrong, starvation is wrong, arbitrarily incarcerating human rights defenders is wrong. A third point I want to make about so called natural rights is it's invoking a sort of um, outdated and I would say extremist interpretation of the foundation of the U.S. As a country. It's a reinterpretation of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and it is a deliberate attempt to use those documents to say things like racial justice, workers' rights, women's rights, and LGBTQI rights are not core or fundamental rights. They're conditional, they're political priorities. And so, in this context, um, you know, I hope a lot of the people listening right now are saying, I don't really know what natural rights is. Um, because one of the ways that we can fight against it is by questioning its authenticity and really, rushing to defend human rights law instead. But, how can we survive as human rights advocates today? Um, we can survive by defending the concepts that we've already agreed upon. Let's not have let's not have backsliding where there have been agreements, but also let's not stop fighting for something more ambitious. You know, uh, right now you see attacks on the word gender in human rights spaces and a move away from saying gender-based violence to saying violence against women. One of the ways that we who believe in human rights will survive is by saying these are red lines for us. We absolutely cannot lose the ground that we've already achieved. Um, and I think, and I'll just say in the long term, militarism is never the answer. Militarism is the strategy of last resort. And for anyone who wants to avoid the catastrophe caused by war, investing in human rights is the answer.
Thanks, Jessica. Desiree, did you want to come in?
Yeah, and I see we're getting a lot more questions in the chat. So let me just try and briefly answer Yolanda's question. And Yolanda, thanks for joining and for your kind comment. What should the message be for the remaining 3 years of the current administration? Um, I think it's really important as the U.S. government is becoming increasingly more hostile towards, human rights, towards marginalized communities. It's more important than ever that civil society, average Americans, academics, etc., stand in that void and say, no, this is not reflective of our beliefs, right? This is not what we believe as Americans. And it's really important, particularly for international partners that are feeling vulnerable, that are feeling abandoned, particularly by the freeze in foreign assistance or the decimation of foreign assistance, that they have other American partners to turn to. And so for the next 3 years, we kind of have to hold the line, right? If we don't want a complete decimation of not only our own credibility and reputation, but also the international infrastructure to support basic human rights and dignity. I'll pause there because there are a lot of other questions, and I also want to allow other folks to jump in.
Maybe I'll just summarize some of the questions that are there because I think we're getting close to, now that we're at the top of the hour, the closure of the webinar. Some of the questions were about the disconnect between the standards on paper and what people experience in real life. How do we close that gap? Um, how do we counteract negative and dehumanizing narratives that are coming from our world leaders right now, and that do affect whether the standards are very strong on paper, that do affect how people experience their realities um, in real life. So maybe I'll open that up and then I'll go to my own final question and allow you guys to have final thoughts.
If I can jump in on that one, I would just say one of the most important things is documentation, right? And so I think having good documentation of the abuses and then working through as you can, depending on country specific, the court system, journalists, people that we are supporting. But I think it's really important if a country is saying this and then this is happening, having good evidence documentation, getting it out there. So then even if that country's legal system is not able to take it up, there are other alternatives in the international system as well to follow up.
I think I would just add definitely documentation, storytelling, super, super important. I mean, I feel like, learned from our ancestors the importance of that, right? And organizing lessons, like organizing 101, always look for the opportunity, the opening to exercise leverage, right? Where is there leverage? We're seeing incredible advances at local levels at this time. The cities that are finding new ways to resist ICE attacks, to show up and to strengthen and deepen ties with international communities and advocates. We're seeing really creative advocacy, legal, and social movement organizing in places. I'm in Boston now, but in New York and Chicago and California, right? And we have to keep our eyes on the prize and keep looking for those places and partners for where we can push the needle to the side of justice. And I think, I'm reminded, my mother grew up in the Dominican Republic during the 30-year military dictatorship. And she told me as a child what it was like to experience the kind of chilling effects that we're only starting to, many of us, see, in our daily lives. And I think about her resilience, her ability and what she learned from her family line about the need to have faith that we can find another way forward, and we have to. And yeah, I think again, am always impressed by what we're seeing at the local level, and really hopeful about the opportunities that this moment will offer us to fix the things that were wrong to begin with. Many of us had different views from the administration on many important issues when we were working for it. And I constantly now am talking to former government officials about where we should have done better and could have and needed to. And this is the time for us to really be honest about that.
I can jump in and then Jessica can bring us home.
Yes.
I want to pick up on something that Kelly said, which I think is really important. And she was talking about the example of her mother having lived through a 30-year dictatorship. What has given me hope and what I think is going to be important in this moment so that we don't fall into despair is looking at our history. And I use the word "our" very broadly. I think it's important to look at other global movements of oppressed people, of people that have successfully fought back against authoritarianism. But I also think as Americans, it's important to acknowledge that this is not our first experience with fascism or authoritarianism, right? Look at the Black people in this country. For centuries, Black people had lived under authoritarianism, right? Their basic rights and humanity denied. And even after slavery was abolished, there was the Jim Crow system. So I think it's important to look at the civil rights movement, of the abolitionist movement in this country, and remember that we have been through really dark times before and we have gotten over them. And I also think it's really important to recall something that Aminta mentioned earlier, and that following great moments of progress, there's always backlash. We have been experiencing lots of progress. And so now we're in the backlash phase. The challenge for us is to continue to propel forward and not not let us just naturally go as far back as anti-rights folks are trying to take us. And so I know that can seem abstract, but I think it is really important to look at history so that we don't lose perspective because we have been in these places before.
Always
So
read
much.
your history books. That is the answer for sure.
Definitely.
Well, Ruben, thank you so much for your question. Ruben asked, how can local human rights commitments be upheld when Trump and other leaders worldwide are legitimizing homophobia and the UN doesn't take action? Um, I'll answer that in a couple ways. Going to keep going from the bitter pill to the sugar. The truth is, I mean, Ruben is spot on with his question. I mean, when powerful world leaders like Trump, like Bolsonaro, like Erdogan, like Museveni, like Putin, um, are openly homophobic and transphobic, it provides sanction for other countries to do the same. It legitimizes the mistreatment not only of LGBTQI people, but of a minority group. Um, and that becomes a green light for other governments. I was in South Africa 2 weeks ago and I met with an activist from Burundi who said to me, you know, look, when your government catches a cold, my government sneezes. And like what that's really emphasizing is not only the disproportionate influence of some countries around the world, like the US, but the ways that when the US withdraws its political support for human rights, especially for marginalized people like queer folks, it has devastating consequences around the world. Um, but now I'm going to tell you something that gives me a little bit more hope. Um, I don't think the UN was ever designed to replace local community organizing. And I think looking to the UN to enforce standards at the local level is asking way too much of this system. It's a norm setting body. And it's a place for state to state negotiations. But the way we get through this is through horizontal organizing, by me talking to my neighbors and doing door knocking and being active in my religious groups and being visible at work and, telling people within my community what it likes looks like to show up for me right now, but then also asking how I can show up for them. And I see people doing that right now. And I think maybe one of the lessons learned of the past few years is we looked upward in kind of lateral structures for answers when we needed to spend more time on horizontal structures, our communities around us. Um, and then I'll just say, in terms of the sort of global landscape, I also see that. Um, Yet another reminder, the world does not revolve around the United States. And so while the US is withdrawing support from a lot of key issues in this space and others, other countries are filling the gap. So in terms of support for LGBTQI rights, I see the governments of Colombia and South Africa and Spain and Canada stepping up. And I think in the long term, that's better for all of us. We don't want to be so dependent on one or a few governments for our rights. And in a multipolar world, that's going to be the reality. So we really need to focus on generating champions everywhere. And I think it's happening.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think I will bring our webinar to a close. I feel like that's a perfect place to end. Just reminding some of the ideas that you all spoke about of what we all can do to better the human rights system, but also better translate these norms locally and make sure that they actually have an impact on people's lives. And I hear from Maggie, she says we need to remember our role, like the role that we all play in building these institutions, and to have pride in that and not to turn our backs on that history. Jessica, you said we need to imagine for the future, hold the line, and then keep dreaming for even better than what we had before. Kelly says we got to keep pushing the needle no matter what the environment around us shows us. And Desiree, you said we need to learn from our history and each other. I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, inspiring the anti-apartheid movement, being a ray of hope during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So yes, that history can inspire us both across generations, but also across borders. And then I would add my own point there, which is to build. I think there was a really inspiring speech by Professor Ellen Jenkins at the law school, another human rights advocate, and many others who have also made this point that after Reconstruction, when there was just a reign of racial terror and lynchings and backlash against the election of Black Americans to public office, that this was the greatest period of civic institution building ever in the US. Where we had a lot of our libraries, our religious institutions, our universities, our civic institutions and NGOs and our schools that were built. So I feel like this is the time that we're in right now. I want to echo, this is obviously not my own idea, but the echo the inspirational thoughts of others. So with that, I'll bring our webinar to a close. Thank you everyone for joining us. I would also like to thank our truly thoughtful, inspiring panelists for sharing their experiences and words of wisdom with us today. That's Desiree Cormier Smith, Maggie Doherty, Jessica Stern, and Kelly Fade Rodriguez, this first inaugural class of Senior Human Rights and Foreign Policy Fellows at the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights. And thank you to the Center for sponsoring and organizing this event. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.